What if the empire your history books dismissed in a single breath was the force that first stitched Eurasia together at continental scale, and in doing so, set in motion everything that followed? Most people hear the word Mongol and think of one thing: destruction. Cities reduced to ash, rivers choked with the dead, a wall of horsemen erasing everything in their path. And that picture is not wrong. Scholars who have studied the Mongol conquests place their death toll among the highest of any imperial expansion in pre-modern history. Some estimates reach 40 million, others reach higher. The uncertainty itself tells you something about the scale. But here's what your history class almost certainly never told you. The same empire that burned Baghdad and shattered the Islamic Golden Age also connected China to Europe in sustained, organized exchange for the first time in history. It carried the plague that killed a third of Europe. It created the postal infrastructure that made continent-wide communication possible. It built a model of governing diverse populations that no civilization had attempted at comparable scale. And it helped set in motion the commercial pressures that sent European sailors searching for new routes to Asia. And those searches changed the map of the world permanently. The Mongol Empire lasted less than 2 centuries. As a unified political entity, the world it helped shape has lasted 800 years and is still working itself out today. This is the entire history of the Mongol Empire. And I promise you, nothing about it is what you expect. Chapter 1. A World Before the Storm. To understand how the Mongols rose, you first have to understand what they rose into. Because the Mongol Empire was not built in a stable world, it was built into a world that had every reason to believe its existing order was permanent, and no reason whatsoever to expect that a band of horsemen from one of the most remote landscapes on Earth was about to change everything. Go back to the middle of the 12th century. The year is approximately 1150. Stand at the center of the known world and look around. To the east, China is the wealthiest and most technologically sophisticated civilization on the planet. It has already invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Its population is somewhere between 100 and 120 million people, more than the entire population of Europe at the same moment. But China in 1150 is not unified. It is fractured between competing dynasties. In the north, the Jurchenjin dynasty controls the Yellow River heartland and the old imperial capitals. In the south, the Song dynasty governs from Linan, present-day Hangzhou, presiding over a commercial economy of extraordinary sophistication with paper currency, long-distance trade networks, and a civil service system built on competitive examinations that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. Between them and to the northwest sits the Tangut Kingdom of Xixia, a state that has carved out its own space in the gaps between larger powers and maintained it through a combination of military skill and diplomatic maneuvering for 2 centuries. To the west, the Islamic world is at what many historians consider its high medieval peak. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad remains the symbolic center of Sunni Islam, and Baghdad itself is a city of perhaps several 100,000 people, making it one of the largest urban concentrations on Earth. Its libraries, hospitals, and scholarly institutions represent an accumulation of knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab traditions that has no equivalent anywhere else. The historian Hugh Kennedy, in his study of the Abbasid Caliphate, published in 2004, describes Baghdad in this period as a genuinely cosmopolitan intellectual center where philosophers, mathematicians, Physicians and theologians from different traditions worked in proximity and sometimes in genuine collaboration. The Islamic world in 1150 stretches from Spain to Central Asia, governed by a patchwork of caliphs, sultans, and local rulers who compete fiercely but share enough common cultural and religious framework to constitute something recognizable as a civilization. Further west, Christian Europe is in the middle of its own period of expansion and confidence. The Crusades have been running for 60 years. European knights have established Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land. The cathedral building programs that will produce Notre Dame, Chartres, and Canterbury are either underway or being planned. Universities are being founded in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Europe in 1150 is a civilization on the move, building, expanding, and arguing about theology with an intensity that suggests genuine intellectual energy. And then there's the steppe. The Eurasian steppe is one of the largest continuous grassland ecosystems on Earth, stretching from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. A belt of open grassland, approximately 5,000 miles long and several hundred miles wide. For most of recorded history, the civilizations at its edges have regarded it with a mixture of contempt and fear. Contempt because it produced no cities, no great temples, no written literature that the settled peoples could read or admire. Fear because it periodically produced armies that emerged without warning and hit with a speed and violence that no conventional defense could absorb. The people who lived on the steppe were not primitive. This point deserves more emphasis than it usually receives in popular history. Steppe pastoralism, the practice of moving herds of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats across seasonal grazing routes, was an extraordinarily sophisticated economic and ecological system. It required detailed knowledge of terrain, weather, animal behavior, and the movements of other groups. It produced a form of horsemanship so advanced that steppe warriors could shoot accurately from a galloping horse in any direction, including directly behind them, a skill that took years of training beginning in early childhood. It developed metallurgy, leatherwork, and textile traditions of genuine quality. And it developed social and political structures capable of organizing large numbers of people across vast distances without the cities and bureaucracies that settled civilizations considered the only possible basis for complex governance. But the steppe also had structural features that made political stability genuinely difficult to achieve, and even more difficult to maintain. The most important of these was the problem of resources. The steppe is productive enough to support pastoralism, but it does not produce the agricultural surplus that allows settled civilizations to build up stored wealth over generations. A steppe community's wealth is its herds, and herds are vulnerable to the same disasters that affect all living things. A bad winter, a drought, an epidemic among the animals can destroy the economic foundation of a community in a single season. This created constant pressure toward raiding, toward taking from settled neighbors or from other steppe groups what the steppe itself could not reliably provide. The political consequence of this structural pressure was a pattern that repeated itself across centuries of steppe history. A charismatic leader would emerge, demonstrate success in raiding and warfare, attract followers from surrounding groups, build a coalition large enough to project force against the settled civilizations at the steppe's edges, and then face the fundamental problem that success creates. The followers who had joined for the rewards of raiding expected those rewards to continue. The coalition that had formed around a specific leader's personal charisma had no institutional basis for surviving that leader's death. The historian David Christian, In his comprehensive study of Inner Asia, published in 1998, describes this pattern as the steppe cycle, noting that it had produced a series of powerful nomadic confederacies: the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Uyghurs, that had risen, dominated their neighbors for a generation or two, and then dissolved back into fragmentation. The Mongols of the mid-12th century were not yet a people in any unified sense. They were a collection of related but competing tribes, clan, and lineages scattered across the eastern steppe, speaking related languages, sharing broadly similar customs and material culture, and fighting each other with the sustained ferocity of people competing for the same limited resources in the same limited space. The great powers at the edges of the steppe had every interest in keeping the Mongols fragmented. A divided steppe was a manageable steppe. A unified steppe was something else entirely. Into this world, in a year that the sources place somewhere between 1155 and 1162, a boy was born near the Anan River in what is now northeastern Mongolia. His father named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had just captured. It was not a name given with prophecy in mind. It was a name given by a man who had just won a fight and wanted to mark the occasion. No one at the Onan River that day had any way of knowing what the boy would become. The world around him was vast, complex, and apparently stable. The great civilizations to his south and west had been building for centuries and expected to continue building for centuries more. They were wrong. And the reasons they were wrong tell you something essential, not just about the Mongols, but about how power actually works in human history. About how the things we assume are permanent are sometimes the most fragile, and about how the chaos that seems most threatening is sometimes, for the person with the right eyes, the most profound invitation. The storm was coming. No one could see it yet, but it was already taking shape in the cold along the river, in the body of a child whose name meant iron, and whose life was about to begin in the worst possible way. Chapter 2. The child born from blood. There is a particular kind of person that extreme hardship produces, not the kind that motivational speakers describe. The person who suffers and emerges stronger and wiser and grateful for the lessons. The kind that history actually records more often. The person who suffers, survives, and comes out the other side with a clarity about power so cold and so complete that it frightens even the people who benefit from it. Temujin was that kind of person. And to understand what he built, you have to understand what was done to him first. He was approximately 9 years old when his father Yesugei took him south to find a bride from the Ongirat tribe, following the custom that required a boy to live with his future wife's family for a period before marriage. The girl's name was Borde. By the accounts that survive, filtered through later chronicles shaped by the political needs of his descendants, Yesugei was satisfied with the arrangement and left his son in the care of Borte's family. On the way home, Yesugei stopped to share food and drink with a group of Tatars. Hospitality on the steppe was not optional. Refusing to share a meal was an act of hostility. Accepting one carried its own risks. The Tatars recognized Yesugei as an enemy and poisoned him. He made it home but died within days, leaving behind a widow named Holun, several young children, and no political protection of any kind. What happened next tells you more about the steppe world Temujin grew up in than almost anything else. The tribe that Yesugei had led abandoned his family. They rode away and left a widow and her children to survive alone on the steppe, which was, in practical terms, a sentence of slow death. The steppe without a clan was not survivable. There was no mechanism for lone families to obtain the resources, protection, and cooperation that life in that environment required. Leaving someone behind was not cruelty in the emotional sense. It was a rational calculation. A widow with young children was a liability the clan could not afford. Holland did not accept the sentence. The chronicles describe her riding after the departing clan, screaming at them, waving the clan banner to shame them into turning back. They did not turn back. She returned to her children and began the work of keeping them alive through means that the steppe did not normally provide to women and children alone. They fished. They dug up roots and berries. They caught small animals. They survived winters that killed healthy adults with full tribal support. Temujin grew up in this condition, not the son of a chief living in the comfort of tribal hierarchy, which was what his birth should have provided, but a boy on the margins of everything, learning from the earliest age that the structures other people relied on could be taken away without warning and without appeal. There is a moment from his early adolescence that the secret history of the Mongols, the earliest and most important Mongolian primary source compiled sometime in the 13th century, records with an emotional directness that the scholar Igor de Rashawiltz, who produced the authoritative translation published in 2004, considers unusually vivid for a document of its type. Temujin and his half-brother Begder got into a dispute over hunting spoils. A small thing in any other context, but not small when a family is surviving on the margins of starvation. Temujin and his full brother Kasar shot Begder dead. He was perhaps 14 years old. The act was not heroic, and the chronicles do not present it as heroic. It was the act of a boy who had learned that in the world he lived in, resources were survival, and sharing them with someone who could not be trusted was a risk he could not afford. His mother Holland was furious. She compared her sons to wolves eating their own kind. She was right. And the boy who would become Genghis Khan had already learned, at 14, that the world was not arranged to protect the people he loved, and that the only protection available was the kind he built himself. Then came the Taijouts. The Taijouts were a rival Mongol clan that had abandoned his family after his father's death. When Temujin was perhaps 15 or 16, a Taijiut raiding party came to the family camp and took him prisoner. They held him in a kangu, a wooden collar device that immobilized the neck and arms and was used across Central and East Asia as a method of restraining prisoners. He was moved from family to family within the Taijiut camp, simultaneously a prisoner and a guest, fed and housed, but unable to leave. He escaped during a festival when his guard was distracted. A Taijiut man named Sorkan Shira helped him hide, for reasons the sources do not fully explain. Perhaps sympathy, perhaps calculation about which way the political wind might eventually blow. Temujin hid in a river, submerged to his neck, for hours while Taijiut searchers passed close enough to see him. When they were gone, Sorkan Shira helped him recover his horse, and he rode home. Sit with what these early experiences produced in the person who lived through them. Abandonment by his own people, his father poisoned, his family left to starve, his own act of lethal violence at 14, capture and imprisonment. A successful escape built on one man's unexpected kindness. The psychologist and historian of Central Asia René Grousset, writing in the 1940s, suggested that Temujin's childhood created a man who trusted almost no one by default and rewarded loyalty with an intensity that bordered on the absolute, precisely because he had experienced its absence so completely. The historian Timothy May, in his study of Mongol warfare and society, published in 2007, frames it differently, but reaches a similar conclusion, noting that Temujin's rise depended on his ability to build personal bonds of loyalty that transcended tribal identity, and that this ability grew directly from his experience of what happened when tribal identity was the only thing you had and it failed you. He went back for Borte. The betrothal arranged by his father had not been forgotten. Borte's family had kept the agreement despite everything. Temujin arrived to claim his bride, and Borte's family gave him not only their daughter, but a wedding gift of genuine value: a sable fur coat. That coat was not decorative. It was a diplomatic instrument. Temujin knew exactly what he needed, and he used it immediately. He rode to the camp of Togrul, the leader of the powerful Karaite tribe and an old ally of his father, and presented the sable coat as a gift. Togrul accepted it and, more importantly, accepted the relationship it represented. He would be Temujin's protector and patron. In exchange, Temujin would be his loyal subordinate and military ally. This was not a small transaction. Togrul was one of the most powerful figures on the steppe. His protection gave Temujin something he had not had since his father died: a place within a recognized political structure, a name that carried the weight of a powerful patron behind it. Then the Merkits came. The Merkits were a steppe tribe with an old grievance against Temujin's family. Yesugei had, years before Temujin's birth, taken Holen from a Merkit man by force, which was not unusual on the steppe, but was not forgotten. The Merkits raided Temujin's camp and took Borte. She was pregnant. When she was eventually recovered, months later, she gave birth to a son named Jochi, and the question of whether Jochi's father was Temujin or a Merkit captor was never definitively resolved. The historian Paul Rachnevsky, in his biography of Genghis Khan, published in 1991, treats this ambiguity as historically significant because it shaped the succession politics of the empire for generations. Temujin recognized Jochi as his son. He never publicly denied it, but the whispers followed Jochi his entire life and contributed to a fracture in the dynasty that would matter enormously after Genghis died. Temujin recovered Borte with the military help of Togrul and his childhood friend Jamukha, and the campaign against the Merkits was his first real military action as a leader. He was effective. His men followed him. The victory produced the most important currency on the steppe: reputation. Word spread that Temujin fought well, rewarded his followers, and did not leave his people behind. That last point was not accidental. Temujin made a deliberate practice of going back for prisoners, including people of low status, whose rescue cost time and genuine risk. The historian Jack Weatherford, in his study of Genghis Khan, published in 2004, argues that this practice was one of the most powerful recruitment tools Temujin possessed, because it communicated something that words alone could not. This leader does not abandon people. In a world where abandonment had been the defining experience of Temujin's own childhood, the message was not rhetorical. It was personal, and it worked. Followers began coming, not in large numbers yet, but enough to matter, enough to notice. The steppe world watched a man who had been left for dead begin, slowly and with great deliberateness, to become someone that the people who had left him might eventually have reason to fear. He was not yet 30. The world had not yet given him any reason to believe he would become anything more than a moderately successful steppe chieftain, one of dozens who rose and fell in each generation. The great powers to his south and west were not paying attention. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. Chapter 1. A World Before the Storm. Chapter 3. Genghis Khan and the art of making a people, there is a question that historians of the Mongols return to repeatedly. And it is a more interesting question than it first appears. What exactly was the genius of Genghis Khan? The obvious answer is military. He conquered more territory than any individual commander in history. He defeated armies that outnumbered his own, took cities defended by walls that had stopped every previous attacker, and maintained operational coherence across campaigns spanning thousands of miles. The military answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And the part it misses is actually the more important part. Military victories end when the fighting stops. What Genghis Khan built lasted long after the fighting was over. To understand why, you have to look at what he built between the battles. And what he built between the battles was something that no previous steppe leader had managed to build and make stick. He built a people. The process that transformed a scattered collection of competing Mongol tribes into a unified political entity took approximately 20 years, from roughly the late 1180s to 1206. When the Great Assembly of Steppe leaders, called the Kurultai, gathered on the banks of the Onon River and proclaimed Temujin with a title that would define him in history. The word Genghis is most commonly transliterated from the Mongolian Chinggis, and its precise meaning has been debated by scholars for centuries. The most widely accepted interpretation, supported by the linguist Igor de Reshaped, among others, renders it as something close to universal ruler or oceanic ruler. Not ruler of the Mongols, ruler of all. To get from the young man recovering Borte from the Merkits to the man who received that title required a series of political and military campaigns that reshaped the steppe completely. And the way Temujin conducted those campaigns reveals the quality that distinguished him from every steppe leader who had come before. He understood that the steppe cycle of rise and fall was driven by a structural problem, and he was the first steppe leader in history to solve it. The problem was loyalty. Steppe confederacies had always been built on personal allegiance to a specific charismatic leader, reinforced by tribal kinship ties and the expectation of continued rewards. When the leader died, the confederacy dissolved because the thing that held it together was gone. When the rewards stopped, the followers left. It was as simple and as fatal as that. Temujin's solution was to replace tribal identity with institutional identity. This sounds abstract until you understand what it meant in practice. In practice, it meant a revolution in how the steppe organized itself that was as consequential in its own context as any constitutional reform in settled civilization. The first and most important change was the decimal military organization. Temujin reorganized his forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. What was genuinely new was the deliberate destruction of tribal coherence within those units. Men from different tribes and clans were mixed together in the same units, serving under commanders who owed their positions not to birth or tribal standing, but to demonstrated competence and personal loyalty to Temujin. A man from one tribe found himself sleeping, eating, drilling, and fighting alongside men from tribes that had been his enemies weeks or months before. Over time, the unit became his primary identity. The army superseded the tribe. The consequences of this restructuring were enormous, and they operated on multiple levels at once. Militarily, it meant that Temujin's forces could not be paralyzed by the defection of a single tribal contingent, which had always been the critical vulnerability of steppe armies. Psychologically, it meant that a man's survival and advancement depended on the performance of his unit rather than on the political fortunes of his birth clan. And, politically, it meant that Temujin was building an army whose loyalty ran to him and to the institution he was creating, rather than to the tribal structures that had always been available as alternative centers of allegiance. The second structural innovation was the yasa, the body of law and custom that Genghis Khan developed and promulgated across his lifetime. The historian David Morgan, in his foundational study of the Mongols, published in 1986, notes that no complete version of the yasa survives, and that our knowledge of its contents comes from references in later sources of varying reliability. But the core principles that those sources consistently describe tell us something important about what Genghis Khan was trying to build. The yasa outlawed the raiding and kidnapping of women from other Mongol groups, which had been one of the primary drivers of intertribal violence for generations. It prohibited the enslavement of Mongols by other Mongols. It established a pragmatic pluralism toward religion, exempting clergy of recognized traditions from taxation and military service. This was not an ideological commitment to tolerance in the modern sense. It was a practical strategy for governing diverse populations without the friction that forced conversion created. It established clear procedures for sharing the spoils of war. And it made the betrayal of a lord to his enemies a capital offense, while simultaneously making it a duty to assist anyone in distress. Read those provisions carefully, and a coherent governing philosophy emerges. The yasa was designed to eliminate the specific sources of internal conflict that had prevented steppe confederacies from holding together, while creating incentives for the cross-tribal loyalty that a permanent state required. The third innovation was meritocracy, and it was the one that his contemporaries found most surprising. On the steppe, as in most human societies of the era, position flowed from birth. Temujin broke this completely. His closest generals and advisors included men of genuinely low social origin who had demonstrated ability and loyalty. Subutai, who would become perhaps the greatest operational commander in Mongol history, was the son of a blacksmith or herder, depending on the source. Under Temujin, he rose to command campaigns spanning multiple continents. Yebe, another of Temujin's greatest generals, first came to his attention by shooting Temujin's horse out from under him in battle. When the fighting was over, Jebi came forward and identified himself as the man who had fired the arrow. He expected death. Temujin gave him a command. The logic was explicit. A man who could identify himself honestly after doing something that dangerous, and who had the skill to make the shot in the first place, was exactly the kind of man worth having. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern, and the pattern was visible across the steppe world. Word spread that in Temujin's forces, ability was rewarded regardless of birth. Loyalty was rewarded with genuine generosity, and betrayal was punished with absolute finality. Men began coming from other groups, sometimes as captured enemies who chose to join rather than die, sometimes as voluntary defectors from tribes whose own leadership could not match what Temujin was offering. His rise was not without setbacks and not without moral cost. An honest history requires acknowledging both. His old friend and ally Jamuka became his most significant rival, and the conflict between them lasted years and divided the Mongol world into two factions. The historian René Grousset and more recent scholars, including Timothy May, both treat the rivalry as genuinely ideological as well as personal, with Jamuka representing the traditional tribal aristocracy and Temujin representing the meritocratic alternative. When Jamuka was finally defeated and captured, Temujin offered him his life in exchange for renewed loyalty. Jamuka refused. He asked for a death without bloodshed, the traditional honorable execution reserved for men of high status. Temujin granted it, whatever else had passed between them. There was enough of the old friendship left for that. The campaign against the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, was more straightforward and more brutal. Temujin defeated them and ordered the execution of every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel, a measurement that in practice meant adult men and adolescent boys, women, and children were distributed among Mongol families. The Tatars, as a distinct people, ceased to exist. It was an act of methodical destruction, carried out not in the heat of battle, but as a deliberate policy decision. The man who built meritocracy and pragmatic pluralism also oversaw the systematic elimination of a people. Both things are true. The history that leaves either one out is not the complete history. By the early 1200s, the steppe was unified in a way it had never been unified before. Every significant rival power on the eastern steppe had been either incorporated into Temujin's structure or eliminated. In the spring of 1206, the Kurultai gathered on the banks of the Onon River, in the land where Temujin had been born and nearly died and survived and built and fought for 30 years. The leaders of the unified Mongol world assembled. A great white standard of 9 yak tails was raised. Shamans performed ceremonies, and the assembly acclaimed the man who had remade their world with a title whose scope contained within it the entire future. Genghis Khan. He was approximately 44 years old. He had survived poisoning, abandonment, kidnapping, imprisonment, betrayal, and more battles than the chronicles could fully record. He had turned a collection of starving families on the edge of extinction into the most formidable military and political organization the steppe had ever produced. He stood on the banks of the river where he had been born into nothing and looked south, where the walls of Shisha and the fortresses of the Jin dynasty stood between him and a world that had barely noticed his existence. That was about to change, and the world that had ignored him was about to learn what it cost to look away from the wrong man. Chapter 4. The War Machine. Quote, "There is a temptation, when describing the Mongol army, to reach for the word horde. It is the word that European chroniclers used when they first encountered Mongol forces in the 13th century, and it has stuck in the popular imagination ever since. A horde suggests something overwhelming by sheer mass, a wave of undifferentiated humanity crashing against walls until they break from the weight of numbers. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and understanding why it is wrong is essential to understanding how a population that never exceeded 2 million people conquered territories containing hundreds of millions. The Mongol army at its peak was not large by the standards of the civilizations it defeated. When Genghis Khan launched his first major campaigns against the Jin dynasty of northern China, his total forces numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 men. According to estimates derived from the decimal organization records analyzed by the historian Timothy May in his study of the Mongol art of war, published in 2007, the Jin dynasty he was attacking could field armies 2 and 3 times that size from a population base perhaps 50 times larger. The Mongols did not win because they had more men. They won because of something considerably more interesting and considerably more difficult to replicate. They won because they had built the most sophisticated military intelligence, logistics, and combined arms system that the medieval world had yet produced, and because they trained for years to execute it with a precision that their opponents consistently underestimated until it was too late to matter. Start with intelligence. Before any major Mongol campaign, reconnaissance units moved through the target territory months and sometimes years in advance. These were not simple scouts. They were systematic information gatherers who mapped roads, identified water sources, assessed the political relationships between local powers, located merchants who could be cultivated as informants, and evaluated the defensive capabilities of every significant city and fortress in the campaign area. The historian John Mann, in his biography of Genghis Khan, published in 2004, describes the Mongol intelligence apparatus as unusually systematic for a 13th century military organization, one that gathered and applied information about opponents in ways that consistently shaped campaign planning before the first soldier crossed a border. Each Mongol warrior maintained a string of horses, typically between 3 and 5 animals, which he rotated to prevent any single horse from being ridden to exhaustion. This meant the Mongol army could sustain a pace of movement that no contemporary force could match. At full speed, a Mongol force could cover 60 to 80 miles in a single day. A medieval European army on campaign typically managed 10 to 15 miles. The difference was not just speed, it was strategic surprise. An army that could be 200 miles away and then appear outside your walls in 3 days was an army that made conventional defensive planning nearly useless. The horses also provided a significant portion of the army's food supply. Mongol warriors on campaign could operate in terrain and for durations that would have been impossible for armies dependent on grain supply lines. The logistical tail that slowed every other medieval army was dramatically shorter in the Mongol case, which meant the army moved faster, required fewer fixed supply points, and could sustain operations in areas where conventional armies would have struggled. The weapons and tactics of the Mongol army combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that no single tradition had managed to combine before. The core of the army was the mounted archer, and the Mongol composite bow was one of the most powerful handheld ranged weapons of the medieval period. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew bound together with a technique refined over generations. It had a draw weight of approximately 160 pounds and an effective range of 200 to 300 meters, considerably outranging most contemporary bows. A Mongol warrior trained from childhood could release approximately 10 aimed shots per minute from horseback at full gallop. But the Mongol army was not only cavalry archers. As campaigns expanded into territories with different military traditions, the army absorbed and incorporated specialists from every conquered people. Chinese engineers brought siege technology. Persian and Chinese chemists brought expertise with incendiary weapons. Muslim administrators brought skills in organizing logistics at scales beyond anything the steppe tradition required. The army that began as a steppe cavalry force became, over the course of the early campaigns, something closer to a combined arms force that could storm fortified cities, conduct river crossings, and maintain supply lines across steppes, deserts, and mountain ranges simultaneously. The siege capabilities deserve particular attention because they are perhaps the element most surprising to people whose image of the Mongols is purely of open-field cavalry warfare. When Genghis Khan first encountered the walled cities of Xixia, his forces did not initially have the capability to breach them. He noted the problem and fixed it with the practical directness that characterized his approach to every obstacle. He recruited engineers, acquired siege equipment, conducted experiments against smaller fortifications, and built up a siege capability over years of deliberate effort. Chinese engineers supervised the construction of equipment on site from locally available materials, meaning the Mongols did not have to transport heavy siege engines across the steppe. They transported the knowledge and the personnel and built the weapons where they were needed. The tactical system that tied all of these capabilities together was built around the tulugma, the standard attack formation, and the feigned retreat. The Tulugma divided forces into center and wing formations that could operate semi-independently while remaining coordinated, surrounding an enemy force on multiple sides and forcing it to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. The feigned retreat was its most psychologically effective component. Mongol cavalry would engage an enemy force, draw it into pursuit with what appeared to be a disorganized withdrawal, lead it into terrain chosen in advance, and then turn and destroy it when it was strung out and separated from support. The feigned retreat was not a complex tactic. Armies and commanders who had encountered the Mongols before knew it existed. The problem was that knowing about it and defending against it were two entirely different things. The historian J.J. Saunders, in his History of the Mongol Conquests, published in 1971, notes that the feigned retreat required a level of unit discipline that was almost impossible to maintain under the psychological conditions of actual combat, and that the Mongols managed it consistently across decades and campaigns against opponents of widely varying quality was itself evidence of the training system that produced it. That training system began in childhood, and its central mechanism was the nurge, the great hunt, several times each year. Mongol forces conducted coordinated hunting operations across areas sometimes hundreds of miles in diameter. The nurge was not primarily about obtaining food. Though it obtained food, it was military training conducted at operational scale, in real terrain, under conditions of genuine physical hardship. The entire force would form a vast encircling line and begin contracting inward over days and sometimes weeks, driving all game before it until the animals were concentrated in a shrinking space from which there was no escape. The operation required exactly the same skills as a military campaign. Units had to maintain their positions in the line, communicate across distances, respond to unexpected developments without breaking the overall pattern, and coordinate with units they could not directly see or contact. A Mongol warrior who had participated in dozens of nurge operations over years of training had internalized the operational logic of large-scale coordinated movement so completely that he could execute it in the chaos of actual battle, without requiring constant, detailed instruction. The unit cohesion, spatial awareness, and physical endurance that the nurge developed were precisely the qualities that made Mongol armies capable of the movements that contemporary observers found inexplicable. Add to all of this a command culture that was, for its era, unusually tolerant of initiative at lower levels. Genghis Khan's commanders were given objectives and the resources to achieve them, and were then trusted to find the best method. The General Subutai, operating thousands of miles from the main Mongol force, made tactical decisions in real time without the ability to consult higher command. He was expected to succeed and was given the authority to do whatever success required. The contrast with the command cultures of the armies he defeated, in which lower commanders frequently waited for authorization rather than acting on observed opportunities, was a consistent source of Mongol advantage in engagements where speed of decision mattered more than anything else. The psychological dimension of the Mongol way of war was as deliberately constructed as the tactical system, and in some respects more effective. The Mongols offered a clear and consistent choice to every city and territory they approached. Surrender without resistance, and the population would be spared. Local administrators would be retained or replaced, and trade would continue under Mongol protection. Resist, and the consequences would be severe and systematic. The policy was not random or emotional. It was strategic. A city that had heard what happened to the last city that resisted had a rational basis for opening its gates. The historian Stephen Pow, in research published in 2019, examining the Mongol campaigns in Europe, emphasizes that the terror the Mongol reputation generated was a force multiplier that reduced the cost of conquest by inducing surrender without siege. The problem, from a moral standpoint, is that the consequences of resistance were real and thorough. When cities resisted and were taken by force, the killing that followed was systematic. Both functions, punishment for resistance and message to the next city, were served by the same act. The historian Mikhail Biran, in her study of the Mongol Empire and world history, published in 2007, notes that this combination of military capability and psychological pressure created a feedback loop. Each successful campaign made the next campaign easier because the reputation of the army preceded it. Military capability created victories. Victories created reputation. Reputation reduced the resistance that military capability had to overcome. The world that encountered this system for the first time had no framework for understanding it. Commanders who measured armies by their numbers underestimated it. Rulers who expected conventional siege and battle patterns were outmaneuvered before they understood what was happening. The machine had been built. It was ready. And the man who built it was looking south and east at a world that did not yet know his name. It was about to learn, and the learning would be the kind that no civilization ever fully recovers from. Chapter 5. Fire from the East. In the spring of 1207, 1 year after being proclaimed Genghis Khan at the Kurultai on the Onon River, the newly titled universal ruler led his forces south toward the Tangut kingdom of Shisha. It was the first major campaign of the Mongol Empire, and the choice of target was not accidental. Shisha was not the most powerful state on Genghis Khan's horizon. The Jin dynasty of northern China was far larger and far wealthier. But Shisha controlled the Hexi corridor, the narrow strip of land running northwest along the edge of the Gobi Desert that connected the Chinese heartland to Central Asia along the old Silk Road routes. Any large-scale campaign west or south required either passing through Shisha territory or moving around it in ways that were logistically prohibitive. Genghis Khan was not simply raiding. He was securing his strategic position before committing to larger objectives. The Shisha campaign also served as a testing ground. The Mongol army that crossed the Gobi in 1207 was a revolutionary new instrument, but it had never been tested against the walled cities and combined arms forces of a settled civilization. The campaigns against other steppe groups had been won by superior organization and cavalry tactics against similar opponents. The Shisha campaign would reveal whether those advantages extended to a fundamentally different kind of warfare. They did, though not without difficulty and not without the kind of practical education that Genghis Khan converted immediately into improved capability. The Tangut cities resisted. Their walls held against initial assault. The Mongols discovered in practice what they had partly understood in theory. That siege warfare required specialized knowledge and equipment they did not yet fully possess. Genghis Khan adapted. He withdrew, incorporated what he had learned, recruited personnel with relevant expertise, and returned. The Shisha king eventually submitted, paid tribute, and provided military forces for future campaigns. The kingdom was not destroyed on this first encounter. It survived as a vassal state, which was a deliberate choice. Genghis Khan needed a functional Shisha to support later campaigns westward. The destruction would come later, in circumstances that illustrate something important about how the Mongol system handled loyalty and its violation. The campaign against the Jin dynasty began in 1211 and consumed most of the following decade. The Jin were formidable. Their dynasty controlled northern China with a population of perhaps 30 to 40 million people, a professional army that included heavy cavalry, infantry, and their own siege capabilities, and a network of fortifications built specifically to manage the threat from the north. Genghis Khan did not try to conquer all of Jin territory at once. The campaign was systematic and patient in ways that confounded Jin's strategic expectations. Mongol forces would raid deep into Jin territory, destroying agricultural capacity and disrupting the economic base that supported Jin military operations. Then withdraw before the Jin army could concentrate against them. They took border fortifications methodically. They used their intelligence network to identify Jin commanders whose loyalty to the Jin court was uncertain. The historian Herbert Franke, in his contributions to the Cambridge History of China covering this period, describes the Mongol approach to the Jin campaign as combining military pressure with political disruption in ways that weakened the dynasty's internal cohesion at the same time as its military capacity. The Jin capital, at Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, was besieged in 1214 and eventually fell in 1215 after the Jin emperor had already fled south. More importantly, the human capital of conquered Jin territory was systematically assessed and directed toward Mongol purposes. Chinese engineers, administrators, physicians, and scholars were not killed. They were employed. The man who would eventually become Genghis Khan's most important Chinese advisor, Yelu Shukai, was a Khitan nobleman serving the Jin court when the Mongols arrived. He accepted a position in Mongol service. Over the following 2 decades, he would become one of the most influential voices for moderation and administrative sophistication in the early empire, arguing consistently and sometimes successfully against policies of pure extraction in favor of building sustainable governance structures that could generate long-term revenue. Then came the event that transformed the scale of Mongol ambition from regional to continental. The Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II ruled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea, encompassing the great cities of Central Asia, including Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Nishapur. These were not provincial towns. They were among the major urban and intellectual centers of the medieval world, accumulating cultural and economic capital for centuries. Genghis Khan did not initially plan to conquer them. He planned to trade with them. In 1218, he sent a caravan of approximately 450 merchants and an accompanying diplomatic delegation to the Khwarezm Shah with an explicit message. The Mongols wanted trade. They controlled the eastern Silk Road. The Khwarezm Shah controlled the middle section. The combination was potentially profitable for both sides. Genghis Khan's message, as recorded in the Persian historian Juvaini's account, written in the 1250s, explicitly acknowledged the Shah as a ruler of equal standing and proposed a commercial relationship between 2 significant powers. The governor of the Khwarezm border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, had the caravan arrested and the merchants executed. His stated reason was that they were spies. His actual motivation may have included the desire to seize the caravan's considerable wealth for himself. Genghis Khan sent a second delegation, 3 ambassadors, to the Shah, personally demanding the extradition of Inalchuk and an explanation. The Shah executed one of the ambassadors and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved off. A profound humiliation in the cultural context of the era. Genghis Khan withdrew to a mountain and spent 3 days in solitary reflection. The sources, primarily Persian chronicles written after the fact, describe this as a period of communication with the divine. whether or not the theological framing was sincere. Its political function was clear. It transformed what was about to happen from personal vengeance into something that claimed a higher mandate. The men who followed him were not simply soldiers seeking plunder. They were, in the framing their commander had constructed, instruments of a judgment that transcended any individual grievance. What followed between 1219 and 1221 was one of the most consequential military destructions of a civilization in pre-modern history. The Khwarezm Shah made a strategic error of the first order, facing an invasion whose speed and scale he had not anticipated. He chose to distribute his army among the cities as garrison forces, rather than concentrating it in the field for a decisive engagement. His reasoning was that the city's walls would hold the Mongols while he rebuilt his field army. He had not accounted for what the Mongol siege capability had become after a decade of development and refinement. Bukhara fell in February of 1220. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the Friday Mosque, and Persian chronicles describe him telling the congregation that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. Whether he actually said these words, or whether the chronicles placed them in his mouth after the fact, cannot be verified with certainty. But the statement as recorded captures something real about how the Mongols understood and presented their own violence. It was not chaos. It was verdict. Samarkand surrendered in March of 1220 after a siege of 5 days. Craftsmen, scholars, and specialists were separated and sent east to serve Mongol purposes. Samarkand survived, diminished, but not obliterated, because it was too valuable as a functioning city to destroy entirely. Other cities were less fortunate. Urgench resisted with a ferocity that cost the Mongols significant casualties in time. When it finally fell, the killing was systematic. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in the surrounding region for centuries were severely damaged. In some areas of the Khwarezm heartland, the agricultural civilization that had existed for generations did not recover quickly. The numbers attached to the campaign have been debated by historians for centuries, and the debate matters for understanding what actually happened. Medieval sources describe casualties in the millions for individual cities, figures that most modern historians consider vastly exaggerated given what we know about the actual populations of those cities. The scholar Peter Jackson, in his comprehensive study of the Mongols and the Islamic world, published in 2017, argues for casualty figures substantially lower than the medieval maximums, while still acknowledging a death toll in the hundreds of thousands across the campaign as a whole, along with population displacement and infrastructure destruction that caused additional mortality in subsequent years. The honest position requires holding two things at once. The medieval sources exaggerate. The impulse to minimize, because the medieval sources exaggerate, is itself a distortion. The Khwarezm campaign killed very large numbers of people and severely damaged a functioning civilization. The full human cost cannot be precisely quantified, and that uncertainty is itself part of the truth. Genghis Khan turned back east in 1222. He was approximately 60 years old. He launched his final campaign against Xia in 1226, after the vassal kingdom failed to provide the military support it had promised. He died in August of 1227 before the campaign was completed. In circumstances the sources disagree about, the exact location of his burial is one of history's enduring mysteries. Concealed, according to instructions, he reportedly gave himself. Every subsequent attempt to locate the tomb has failed. Xia was destroyed after his death. Its population was killed or dispersed. Its records were so thoroughly eliminated that Tangut history remained poorly understood by outside scholars until the discovery of a major cache of manuscripts in the early 20th century. He left behind the largest contiguous land empire in human history. He left behind 4 sons, whose characters and ambitions would determine whether what he had built was a foundation or a ceiling. He left behind millions of dead, destroyed cities, and the memory of what his army had done seared into the consciousness of every civilization it had touched. Both things were the work of the same man. The history that forgets either one has not yet reckoned with what the Mongol Empire actually was. Chapter 6. The Death of One Man and the Mathematics of Succession. Picture a room in the Topkapi Palace. Not yet the Ottoman palace it would become. But imagine the concept. A young man sits inside walls he has not left in years. His rooms are comfortable. His meals arrive without asking. He has everything a person needs to survive and nothing a person needs to live. He has never commanded soldiers. He has never governed a province. He has never negotiated a treaty or managed a budget or sat in a court and heard a case. He has never been allowed to have children because children might become rival claimants. And he has lived every single day knowing that the most likely reason for a knock at his door is that someone has come to kill him. One morning the knock comes. He refuses to open the door. The delegation on the other side calls his name. They tell him he is the new ruler of the most powerful empire in his world. He still refuses to open the door. He has spent so many years expecting that a knock meant death that he cannot process the possibility that it might mean anything else. He has to be shown the body of his predecessor through a gap in the door before he will believe them. That man was Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire. His story belongs to a different chapter of history. But the principle it illustrates belongs here, at the center of the Mongol story, because the Mongols faced the same structural trap that eventually produced Ibrahim. And the way they failed to fully solve it is the reason the empire they built could not hold together across generations. Every empire that has ever existed has faced the same problem. Not enemies from outside, not geography or economics. The problem that destroys more great institutions than any of those things combined. The problem of what happens after the founder. Genghis Khan had spent 30 years building a system designed to outlast any individual. He replaced tribal loyalty with institutional loyalty. He built a legal framework that operated independently of personal relationships. He created a military structure whose commanders were trained to execute complex operations without constant supervision from the top. In almost every dimension of governance, he had thought carefully about sustainability and built accordingly. There was one dimension where the system was genuinely vulnerable, and the vulnerability was structural. It was built into the deepest assumptions of the steppe world he came from. And even Genghis Khan, who had broken so many of those assumptions, could not fully escape this one. The Mongol tradition of inheritance divided a father's estate among his sons, rather than passing it intact to a single heir, applied to the largest empire in human history. This was a mechanism for fragmentation built into the foundations. Genghis Khan knew this. He held a great assembly sometime around 1218 or 1219 and formally designated his third son, Ogedei, as his overall successor and great Khan. The choice of Ogedei over his older brothers was deliberate and characteristically calculating. To understand why, you need to understand the 4 men he was choosing between. Yohi, the eldest, carried the shadow of uncertain paternity that had followed him since birth, the whisper that had never been silenced. The question of whether he was truly Genghis Khan's son or the child of a merchant captor made him unacceptable to significant portions of the Mongol aristocracy. Chagatai, the second son, was capable and militarily effective, but possessed a rigidity of temperament that made him inflexible in situations requiring political judgment. He was the most traditional of the brothers, the most committed to the letter of the Yasa, and the most likely to turn its enforcement into a weapon against rivals. Tolui, the youngest, was by most accounts the most militarily gifted of the four, but the custom of the hearth inheritance made him the wrong choice for paramount authority over his older brothers. Ogedei was something rarer than any of them. He was affable without being weak, politically shrewd without being the kind of ruthless that generates enemies, generous to a fault, which created personal loyalty in the people around him, and possessed of enough personal authority to manage his brothers without the domineering personality that would have made managing them impossible. Genghis Khan was enough of a realist to understand that governing the governors was the actual job. Ogedei was the most governable choice for it, but even this careful designation could not resolve the deeper structural problem, because the Mongol tradition did not simply divide property. It divided sovereignty. Each of the four sons received an ulus, a territorial allocation with its own population, resources, and military forces. The arrangement was not a clean constitutional structure. It was a negotiated compromise held together by the personal authority of the great Khan and the shared understanding that unity was more profitable than division. When that shared understanding began to erode across generations of increasingly distant cousins, the structural tensions built into the original arrangement would pull the empire apart. Before we follow that story forward, we need to stop at Jochi, because Jochi's story and the unresolved question at its center illuminate the deeper nature of the problem no political structure could fully solve. Jochi died in 1225 or 1226, before his father, under circumstances suspicious enough to generate speculation that has not stopped since. The relationship between Jochi and Genghis Khan had been strained for years by the question that Chagatai had raised publicly and brutally, calling Jochi a merkit bastard to his face in front of the assembled leadership. Genghis Khan had silenced Chagatai and publicly reaffirmed Jochi's status as his son. But the wound was open, and it did not close. Jochi spent the last years of his life in his western territories, increasingly distant from the main Mongol court. The historian Peter Jackson examines this period carefully and notes that the sources do not allow a definitive verdict on whether Jochi's absence reflected genuine illness, political resistance, or some combination of both. What is established is that he died young, that his territories passed to his son Batu, and that the Western Ulus developed from its very founding with an identity somewhat separate from the main Mongol imperial project. The seed of that separateness was planted in a question that was never answered, and unanswered questions, in an empire built on the clarity of the Yasa and the certainty of the great Khan's will, had a way of growing into fractures. After Genghis Khan died, Tolui served as regent while the Kurultai assembled to formally confirm Ogedei as great Khan. The process took approximately 2 years, because gathering the leadership of an empire stretching thousands of miles required time that modern communication cannot compress. The Kurultai of 1229 formally elevated Ogedei to the position his father had designated for him. There is something worth pausing on in the weeks after Ogedei's elevation. The empire that assembled at the Kurultai was not a paralyzed institution grieving its founder. It was a functioning state with an established military, an administrative system, a legal framework, and ongoing campaigns that needed managing. Merchants were moving along the roads that Mongol protection had opened. Administrators were collecting taxes. Military commanders were maintaining the frontier forces that held what had been conquered. The institutional memory of everything that Genghis Khan had built was larger than any single man, including the man who had built it. That was his real legacy. Not the territory, which could be lost, not the victories, which were finished, but the fact that when the man at the top was gone, the thing he had built kept going. He had built something larger than himself. Whether it was large enough to survive what was coming would depend entirely on the man now sitting at its center. Chapter 7. The Peak Ogedei and the Dream of the World. History has not been kind to Ogedei Khan. He does not appear in popular accounts of the Mongol Empire with anything like the frequency of his father or his grandson Kublai. The narrative of Mongol history tends to leap from the founding genius of Genghis Khan to the sophisticated court culture of Kublai Khan, passing over the reign of the man who connected them as though it were merely transitional, a placeholder between two more interesting eras. This is a significant historical injustice, and correcting it requires sitting with a single question. If Genghis Khan built the machine, who ran it at its absolute peak, who took everything his father had built and pushed it further than his father had managed? The answer is Ogedei, and what he accomplished in 12 years was remarkable. Ogedei Khan, who ruled as Great Khan from 1229 until his death in 1241, completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty, extended Mongol authority across Persia and the Caucasus, launched the campaign that brought Mongol forces to the shores of the Adriatic Sea, established the first true capital city of the Mongol Empire, and built an administrative system capable of governing the largest land empire in history. He did all of this while managing a coalition of powerful and independently minded princes who had every reason to pursue their own interests at the expense of collective action. He was also, by the consistent testimony of sources across multiple cultural traditions, a man of genuine personal warmth, unstoppable generosity, and a capacity for alcohol consumption so legendary that it ultimately killed him. These qualities are not incidental to understanding his reign. They are central to it, because Ogedei's personal style of governance, the lavish hospitality, the accessibility, the willingness to forgive mistakes that a harder ruler would have punished, was the political lubricant that kept an inherently fractious coalition functioning across a decade of extraordinary ambition. The completion of the Jin conquest between 1230 and 1234 was the first major achievement of his reign. The Jin dynasty had survived the campaigns of the 1210s in reduced form, controlling the area south of the Yellow River, with its court relocated to Kaifeng. Ogedei coordinated a campaign that combined Mongol forces from the north with an alliance with the southern Song dynasty, which had its own reasons for wanting the Jin destroyed. The Song provided passage and logistical support for Mongol forces operating south of the Yellow River. The combination was decisive. The last Jin emperor died in 1234 as his capital fell, ending a dynasty that had ruled northern China for over a century. The historian Herbert Franke notes the particular strategic significance of the Song alliance, the Southern Song, in agreeing to cooperate with the Mongols against a common enemy, made the error that would eventually cost them their own existence. They demonstrated that Mongol forces could operate effectively in the terrain and climate of southern China. They provided logistical knowledge and infrastructure that would later be used against them, and they established a precedent of accommodation with Mongol power that made subsequent resistance psychologically more difficult. The Jin campaign was not only a military victory, it was a demonstration of how the Mongols used their enemies' pragmatism against them. While the Jin campaign concluded, Ogedei dispatched forces westward under the overall command of his nephew Batu, the son of Jochi, with Subutai as the operational commander. The campaign that followed between 1236 and 1242 covered more ground and defeated more formidable opponents than any previous Mongol operation in the west. The Cumans, a powerful steppe confederation that controlled the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, were defeated and dispersed. Their Khan Kotian fled with approximately 40,000 families into Hungary, requesting asylum from King Bela IV and giving the Hungarian court their first direct experience of what the Mongols had been doing in the east. The Rus principalities, the collection of competing city-states centered on cities including Kiev, Vladimir, and Ryazan, were attacked in the winter of 1237 to 1238. The Mongols chose winter deliberately. The frozen rivers provided highways for cavalry movement. The Rus cities, built in river valleys that were defensible in other seasons, became accessible from every direction at once. Ryazan fell in December of 1237. Vladimir fell in February of 1238. The great city of Kiev, which had been one of the major urban centers of medieval Europe, fell in 1240 after a siege that left it severely devastated. The Franciscan friar Giovanni the Pian del Carpine, traveling through the region 6 years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, described finding the landscape marked by catastrophic destruction on a scale he struggled to convey in words. His account, analyzed by the historian Christopher Dawson in the 1950s, is one of the most detailed Western European eyewitness descriptions of Mongol destruction from this period. Then the Mongols crossed into Central Europe, and the world that had been watching the destruction in the east with a mixture of horror and detachment suddenly found itself directly in the path of something it had no framework to understand or resist. The campaign of 1241 into Poland and Hungary is one of the most studied military operations of the medieval period, and its study consistently produces the same conclusion. The Mongols were not simply better fighters. They were operating according to a different and superior strategic conception that their opponents could not match because they could not fully perceive what it was. The invasion divided into two major prongs. One force moved through Poland, defeating a Polish army at the Battle of Legnica on April 9th, 1241. The other main force under Batu and Subutai moved through Hungary, destroying the Hungarian Royal Army at the Battle of Mohi on April 11th, 1241. 2 days later, these two battles, fought 200 miles apart within 48 hours of each other, were not separate campaigns. They were coordinated elements of a single operational plan designed to prevent the Central European powers from combining their forces. The historian Stephen Pow, in detailed analysis of the campaign published in 2012, demonstrates the degree of operational coordination between the two prongs and concludes that the Mongol command achieved a level of large-scale coordination that had no parallel in contemporary European military practice. At Mohi, the Hungarian army occupied a fortified camp at the confluence of the Sajo and Tisa rivers. The Mongol crossing of the river at night, the suppression of Hungarian defenders with Chinese-designed catapults, and the coordinated assault from multiple directions produced one of the most complete victories of the Mongol period. The Hungarian army was not merely defeated, it was surrounded, pursued, and systematically destroyed. King Bela IV escaped only by riding without stopping to the Adriatic coast, where he eventually found refuge on an island. Mongol forces reached the Adriatic in the spring of 1241. They raided into Austria, the courts of France, the papacy, and the Holy Roman Empire were sending desperate diplomatic communications in multiple directions, trying to organize a response to something they did not understand. And then, in December of 1241, Ogedei Khan died in Mongolia. The causes were almost certainly related to the drinking that had been escalating throughout his reign, despite the interventions of advisors who understood it was killing him. He was approximately 56 years old. He left behind an empire stretching from Korea to the Adriatic, from Siberia to Persia, generating revenue from trade and tribute that dwarfed anything in the contemporary world. The Mongol forces in Europe turned around and went home. European chroniclers interpreted the withdrawal as divine intervention, as proof that God had finally answered the prayers rising from a terrified continent. Some of that interpretation has persisted in popular history as a version of events that attributes the survival of Western Europe to providential protection. The historian Timothy May and others who have examined the campaign carefully offer a more complicated picture. The withdrawal was required by the Kurultai custom, which demanded the presence of all senior Mongol princes at the assembly to choose a new great Khan. Batu and the other commanders had no constitutional choice but to return. Whether the campaign would have continued after a new great Khan was confirmed, and whether Western Europe could have mounted an effective defense if it had, are questions that the historical record cannot definitively answer. What can be said is that no Mongol force ever returned to Central Europe in the same strength. The political circumstances that had made 1241 possible, a unified command structure under a great Khan whose authority the princes acknowledged, were never fully replicated. The succession crisis that followed consumed years and energy that would otherwise have been directed outward. Before we follow that succession crisis into its consequences, we need to spend a moment with what Ogedei built that was not military, because the most enduring achievement of his reign was not the campaign that reached the Adriatic. It was a city in the middle of the Mongolian steppe that most people have never heard of. Karakorum. Ogedei chose a site in the Orkhon River Valley of central Mongolia and ordered the construction of a city. Between 1230 and 1250, Karakorum became the administrative and symbolic center of the Mongol Empire. It was not a large city by the standards of the urban civilizations the Mongols had conquered. The Flemish friar William of Rubruck, who visited Karakorum in 1254, on a diplomatic mission from King Louis IX of France, and left one of the most detailed Western descriptions of the Mongol court, noted that it was smaller than many European towns. What it had was not size, but extraordinary cosmopolitanism. William of Rubruck describes a city containing neighborhoods of Chinese craftsmen, Muslim merchants with their own mosques, Christian communities from multiple traditions with their own churches, and representatives of virtually every people the Mongols had encountered through conquest and trade. The great silver tree that the French goldsmith Guillaume Boucher had built for the court, a fountain designed to dispense different drinks from separate pipes controlled by an angel that blew a trumpet to announce the flow, was, in William's account, a wonder of engineering that demonstrated both the wealth of the empire and the genuinely multicultural character of the court that could commission a French craftsman to build a fountain for a Mongolian palace. Sit with that image for a moment. A French goldsmith building a silver fountain in a city on the Mongolian steppe, at the center of an empire that stretched from Korea to the borders of Austria. Karakorum was not simply a capital. It was a demonstration, a proof that the steppe, which settled civilizations had dismissed as capable of producing nothing but violence, could support a genuine urban center that drew the world to it. The historian Michal Biran describes Karakorum as one of the most genuinely international spaces in the 13th century world, a place where the normal boundaries between civilizations were suspended in favor of a common project of imperial administration. Ogedei did not live to see Karakorum reach its fullest development. He died with the city still under construction, with the empire still at its greatest territorial extent, with campaigns that would test the limits of Mongol power still years in the future. He left behind an empire administratively more sophisticated than the one he had inherited, militarily more extended, economically more productive, and institutionally more complex. He also left behind a succession problem that his father's careful designation had not fully solved. Because the branches of the family had proliferated, the personal relationships that had held the coalition together had attenuated, and the shared understanding that unity was more profitable than division had begun its long erosion. The machine was still running at the highest pitch it had ever reached, but the man who had been running it was gone. And in the space his absence created, the cousins and princes and generals who had served him began the slow calculation that fractures every great institution eventually. Who comes next? And what will they be willing to do to make sure the answer is them? The dream of the world was about to collide with the reality of the family. Chapter 8. 4 Amperes. One family. There is a moment in the life of every great empire when it stops being one thing and becomes several things that share a name. The Roman Empire reached that moment when it divided into eastern and western halves that drifted so far apart they eventually became different civilizations. The Mongol Empire reached it in the decades after Ogedei's death, when the Kurultai system that was supposed to produce unified leadership instead produced deadlock. And the deadlock produced a fracture that no subsequent great Khan was strong enough to reverse. But here is what most histories of this moment miss entirely. The fracture was not the end of the Mongol story. It was the beginning of 4 different Mongol stories, each of which reshaped a major civilization in ways whose consequences are still visible today. Understanding those 4 stories, not as fragments of something broken, but as distinct civilizations in formation, is the only way to grasp the full scope of what the Mongol Empire actually became. The succession crisis that followed Ogedei's death lasted, in its various phases, for nearly 2 decades. Ogedei's widow Torigene served as regent for 5 years, maneuvering with considerable political skill to place her son Guyuk on the Great Khan's throne at the Kurultai of 1246. Guyuk was intelligent and possessed of strong opinions about how the empire should be governed. He was also deeply hostile to his cousin Batu of the Western Territories, a hostility rooted in a personal confrontation during the European campaign that had never healed. He reigned for less than 2 years before dying in 1248, probably from the combination of illness and alcohol that had killed his father. While reportedly marching west toward what most historians believe was a planned confrontation with Batu, the death of Guyuk shifted power from the line of Ogedei to the line of Tolui. Batu, whose western position gave him the role of kingmaker without the desire to be king himself, through his support behind Mongke, the son of Tolu. At the Kurultai of 1251, Mongke became Great Khan. The Ogedei and Chagatai princes, who had expected to retain dominance, were purged with a thoroughness that left the Toluid branch of the family in control of the central imperial apparatus. Mongke was the last Great Khan to exercise genuine authority over the empire as a whole. He was capable, disciplined, personally austere, and possessed of a strategic vision that directed Mongol expansion simultaneously south into China and west into Persia and the Middle East. He sent his brother Kublai to manage the campaign against the southern Song dynasty. He sent his brother Hulagu west with one of the largest Mongol forces assembled since the European campaign, with instructions to extend Mongol authority to the limits of the cultivated world. Hulagu's western campaign between 1253 and 1260 is one of the most consequential military operations in medieval history. And its most consequential single moment is a city. Baghdad in 1258 was not merely a city. It was the symbolic and institutional center of the Abbasid Caliphate, the paramount institution of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries. Its libraries, hospitals, and scholarly institutions represented an accumulation of knowledge that had no equivalent in the medieval world. The historian Hugh Kennedy, in his study of the late Abbasid period, describes the Caliph al-Mustasim as a ruler who had failed to take the military preparations that the approach of a massive Mongol force clearly required. Whether better leadership could have saved Baghdad is a question the sources do not allow us to answer definitively. What is certain is that the city was not saved. The Mongol siege began in late January of 1258. The city's defenses were overwhelmed within days. The Caliph surrendered on February 10, 1258. The sack that followed lasted approximately a week. The Caliph was executed in the manner reserved for rulers of high status whose blood could not touch the ground. Rolled in, felt, and reportedly trampled. A detail that appears in multiple independent sources and is treated by historians, including David Morgan, as broadly credible. The libraries, the hospitals, the scholarly institutions that had made Baghdad the intellectual center of the Islamic world were destroyed or abandoned. The death toll has been subject to the same debates about medieval source reliability that surround the Khwarezm campaign. The historian David Morgan urges particular caution about figures in medieval sources that reach into the millions, noting that such numbers likely exceed what the city's probable population could have supported. What is not in dispute is the scale of the destruction or its long-term consequences. The institution that had provided a framework of political and religious legitimacy for the Sunni Islamic world across 5 centuries was gone. What replaced it was not a single successor institution, but a permanent competition between rival centers of authority, each claiming legitimacy on different grounds. That competition structured the politics of the Islamic world for centuries afterward and contributed, among many other factors across many other centuries, to the fragmented political landscape of the modern Middle East. The historian Janet Abu Lugad, in her study of the pre-modern world system, published in 1989, describes the fall of Baghdad as a genuine turning point, a moment that redirected the center of gravity of Islamic civilization permanently westward toward Cairo and eventually toward Istanbul. Hulagu pressed northwest after Baghdad, taking Syria and approaching Egypt. Then, in 1259, news arrived that Möngke Khan had died while conducting the China campaign. Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his forces east to participate in the Kurultai, leaving a reduced garrison in Syria. In September of 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut in present-day Israel, the Egyptian Mamluk Sultanate met that reduced Mongol force and defeated it. Ain Jalut was the first significant defeat of a Mongol army in open-field battle, and its importance requires careful calibration. The historian Reuven Amitai, in his detailed study of the Mongols and the Mamluks, published in 1995, argues that the Mongol force at Ain Jalut was substantially smaller than the forces that had conducted the major Western campaigns, and that the political circumstances created by Möngke's death, rather than any failure of Mongol military capability, were primarily responsible for the outcome. What the battle did accomplish was the establishment of a frontier. The Mamluks held Syria, the Ilkhanate, as Hulagu's successor state in Persia became known, never successfully pushed past it. The western limit of Mongol expansion in the Middle East had been found. The death of Möngke in 1259, produced the fracture that could not be repaired. His two brothers, Kublai and Arik Bok, both claimed the Great Khanship and the civil war between them. From 1260 to 1264 was the moment when the unified empire became definitively 4 separate successor states that would never again be governed from a single center. Kublai won, but his victory came at the cost of his credibility as Great Khan of an empire that extended beyond his own territories. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia and the Golden Horde in the West acknowledged him in name while operating as fully independent political entities in practice. Now picture each of the 4 successor states and what they became. Kublai Khan's court at Khanbalik, present-day Beijing, was, by the accounts of contemporaries, one of the most magnificent in the world. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who spent approximately 17 years in China between 1271 and 1292, and recorded his observations in a narrative that historians, including Igor de Rochewiltz, have subjected to critical scrutiny, describes a court of extraordinary wealth and administrative sophistication. The specific question of whether Marco Polo actually visited China or compiled his account from other sources is a genuine scholarly debate that has not been fully resolved. The majority of historians who have examined the question tend toward accepting the broad outline of his presence while acknowledging problems with specific details. What Kublai could not fully solve was the tension between being a Chinese emperor and being a Mongol Great Khan. Governing China required working through the Confucian bureaucratic system and earning the legitimacy that system conferred. Being a Mongol Khan required maintaining the military culture and pastoral traditions that connected him to his heritage. He never fully became one or the other. The dynasty he founded reflected that unresolved tension in its institutional structure and in the resentments it generated among a Chinese population that never fully accepted Mongol rule as legitimate. The Yuan dynasty lasted until 1368, when a Chinese rebel movement drove the last Yuan emperor north into the steppe and established the Ming dynasty. The Ilkhanate in Persia underwent a transformation that was, in some respects, even more complete. Hulegu and his immediate successors governed Persia as conquerors who maintained a distinct Mongol identity. But the cultural pull of Persian civilization was enormous. Persian administrators, puts, scholars, and physicians filled the Ilkhanate court. The Persian language became the primary language of administration and culture. And in 1315, the Ilkhanul Jaitu converted to Islam, completing a transformation that had been building for decades. The descendants of the generals who had burned Baghdad and killed the caliph became Muslim rulers of an Islamic civilization. The historian Reuven Amitai and the scholar Charles Melville, in their collaborative studies of the Ilkhanate's religious evolution, trace this conversion as a genuine cultural absorption rather than a purely political act. The conquerors had been conquered by the civilization they had conquered. The Golden Horde that Batu established in the western steppe governed its most important subject civilization at a distance rather than through direct administration. The Rus principalities that had been devastated in 1237 to 1240 continued to exist as subordinate political entities, paying tribute and acknowledging Mongol suzerainty without being directly governed by Mongol administrators. Russian princes traveled to the Golden Horde's court to receive patents of authority confirming their right to rule. This arrangement lasted for what Russian historiography calls the Tatar yoke, approximately from 1240 to 1480, when Ivan III of Moscow formally refused to pay tribute, and the Golden Horde was too fragmented to compel him. The historian Charles Halperin and Donald Ostrowski have both argued carefully that direct institutional borrowing from Mongol practice was more limited than popular accounts suggest. and that many features of later Russian governance that seem Mongol in character may reflect parallel responses to similar challenges rather than straightforward transmission. This scholarly caution matters and should not be dismissed. What neither historian disputes is the reality of 2.5 centuries of Mongol dominance, the demographic disruption of the initial campaigns, and the long-term reshaping of the political landscape within which the Muscovite state developed. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia is the least studied of the four, and in some respects the most significant for what it reveals about the long-term dynamics of the Mongol political inheritance. The Chagatai Khans converted to Islam, patronized Persian and Turkic culture, and their territory became, in the 14th century, the base from which a figure would emerge who claimed the Mongol inheritance while also transforming it. We will meet that figure shortly. What all four successor states shared, despite their divergent cultural trajectories, was a set of administrative and commercial practices derived from the original Mongol imperial project. The postal relay system, called the Yam, created a network of stations and horses that moved messages and authorized travelers at speeds that had no precedent. The protection afforded to merchants traveling under Mongol authority created conditions for long-distance trade that the Silk Road had never previously sustained so consistently. Each successor state maintained these systems because they generated the revenue and stability that made governance possible. These shared practices were the institutional inheritance of what Genghis Khan and Ogedei had built, transmitted through the successor states, even as those states diverged in language, religion, and culture. The Mongol Empire as a unified political entity was over. The network of connections it had created persisted for another century, and it was within that network, sustained by Mongol infrastructure, that something was moving along the trade routes that would reshape the world more completely than any army the Mongols had ever fielded. Something invisible, something that no political authority could stop, something that would make everything that came before it look, in comparison, almost manageable. Chapter 9. Pax Mongolica, the Empire as a Road. There is a paradox at the center of the Mongol Empire that honest history has to hold without flinching. The same network that helped carry the Black Death also carried paper money, new agricultural techniques, astronomical knowledge, and commercial practices that contributed to the transformation of multiple civilizations. The same roads that moved plague from Central Asia to Europe also moved ideas and goods in both directions for generations. The empire that killed enormous numbers of people through conquest also connected civilizations that had never been in sustained contact, producing an exchange whose consequences were visible for centuries afterward. Both things happened. They happened through the same mechanism. At the same time, on the same roads. The concept historians use to describe the stable period of this exchange is the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The term requires immediate qualification. It was not peaceful for the people who were conquered. It was not peaceful for the populations that experienced Mongol punitive campaigns. The peace it describes was the peace of established dominance, the absence of the specific kind of interstate violence that disrupts trade and movement, which is a very different thing from the absence of violence altogether. But within those qualifications, the Pax Mongolica was real, and its effects on long-distance trade and cultural exchange were significant enough to shape the next 3 centuries of world history. The central mechanism was the Yam, the postal relay system that Ogedei developed into the most sophisticated communication network in the pre-modern world. Stations were established at intervals of approximately 25 miles across the empire's road network, each stocked with horses, food, and accommodation for authorized travelers. A Lamsinger carrying imperial authorization could travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than the months or years that the same journey required through any other means. The historian Thomas Olson, in his comprehensive study of Mongol culture and exchange, published in 2001, describes the yam as one of the most significant administrative investments of the medieval world in terms of what it enabled for communication and movement across vast distances. The paisa, a tablet of gold, silver, or bronze that served as an imperial passport and guarantee of safe conduct, transformed the experience of long-distance travel within Mongol-controlled territory. A merchant carrying a paisa could expect to be fed, housed, and protected at yam stations along the route. The protection was real because its enforcement was real, and the practical consequence was a significant reduction in the transaction costs of long-distance trade. Before the Mongol period, a merchant moving goods from China to Persia faced a gauntlet of political borders, each with its own customs officials, its own security risks, and its own potential for confiscation. The Mongol Empire replaced that gauntlet with a single authority whose commitment to protecting authorized commerce was consistent across a vast geographic area. The historian Janet Abu-Lughad's analysis of the 13th century world system describes the Mongol period as a moment when separate regional trading networks were linked into a more interconnected commercial system than had previously existed. Individual merchants had always moved between regions. What the Pax Mongolica created was infrastructure for more sustained, higher volume exchange that intensified contact between distant civilizations in ways that had lasting effects on all of them. The goods that moved through this system were not only physical commodities, though the commodities were significant. Chinese silk and porcelain moved west. Persian glassware and textiles moved east. Indian spices moved in multiple directions. But alongside the goods moved something less tangible and ultimately more consequential. Ideas moved. Technologies moved. Practices moved. Paper money, a Chinese invention that the Mongols adopted and attempted to use across their empire, contributed to discussions in Islamic and eventually European financial traditions about the nature of currency and value. The historian Richard von Glahn, in his study of Chinese monetary history, traces how the Mongol period accelerated the spread of paper currency concepts beyond the Chinese context in which they had developed. The precise pathways of transmission remain subjects of scholarly discussion rather than settled conclusions. But the Mongol period created the conditions for contact that made transmission possible at all. Astronomical knowledge moved in both directions. Islamic astronomers brought their mathematical and observational traditions to Kublai Khan's court, where they interacted with Chinese astronomical traditions. The observatory that the Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi built at Maraga in present-day Iran under Ilkhanate patronage in the 1260s became one of the most important astronomical research centers of the medieval world. The historian George Saliba, in his study of Islamic science, published in 2007, traces connections between Maraga's astronomical work and later developments in European astronomy through intermediary channels. Though the specific mechanisms of influence remain an active area of scholarly investigation, new varieties of crops moved between China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Agricultural practices traveled with the people who carried them. The food diversity of Eurasia increased during and after the Mongol period in ways that had long-term effects on nutrition and agricultural capacity across multiple civilizations. And then there was the plague, the disease that swept through Eurasia between approximately 1346 and 1353 was not created by the Mongols. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had existed in rodent populations in Central Asia long before the Mongol Empire. But the Mongol trade network created conditions that allowed it to travel at greater speed and over greater distances than previous outbreaks had managed. The same roads that moved goods and ideas also moved infected fleas in grain shipments and infected people among the merchants and soldiers and administrators who used the YAM system. The historian Ole Benedicto, in his comprehensive study of the Black Death, published in 2004, estimates the total European death toll at a significant fraction of the population, with figures varying by region and method of calculation. The death toll across the Middle East and Central Asia, where earlier waves had struck, was comparable in severity, according to the historian Michael Doles in his study published in 1977. This was the terrible consequence of the world the Mongol roads had made. Connecting civilizations that had been partially isolated from each other did not only allow the useful things those civilizations had produced to travel between them, it allowed the lethal things to travel as well. The plague did not discriminate between astronomical tables and Yersinia pestis. It traveled on the same roads, in the same ships, with the same merchants. The Pax Mongolica and the Black Death were not opposites. They were the same phenomenon seen from different angles. The consequences of the Black Death for European development created disruptions that restructured the economic and social landscape in ways that compounded across generations. Labor shortages created by massive mortality drove up wages for surviving workers, disrupting the foundations of feudal agriculture and accelerating transitions to more market-based relationships. The Church, which had promised divine protection and failed to deliver it against a disease that killed clergy as readily as it killed anyone else, experienced a loss of moral authority whose effects compounded across the century that followed. The historian David Herlihy, in his study of the Black Death and the Transformation of the West, published in 1997, argues carefully that the demographic shock contributed to structural changes that created new possibilities in the centuries that followed. He is explicit that this is not an argument that the plague was beneficial. It is an observation that catastrophes can create dislocations that stability would have foreclosed. A distinction that matters for understanding how history actually moves. Marco Polo had traveled the Mongol roads in the 1270s and 1280s, returning to Venice with accounts of a world that most Europeans found difficult to believe. His descriptions of Chinese cities and the wealth of the East were so far beyond European experience that many contemporaries doubted them. The specific vision of what lay at the end of routes to the East, the particular sense of the scale and sophistication waiting there, was shaped by the contacts that the Mongol roads had made possible. Columbus carried a copy of Marco Polo's account on his first voyage. He was looking for the wealthy East that medieval accounts had described. He found something else entirely. To say the Mongols caused the age of exploration would be to overstate a complex chain of causes that includes Portuguese maritime ambition, advances in navigation, and the particular pressures of European commercial competition. But the Mongol roads were part of the context within which European geographical imagination took the specific form that drove those voyages. The Mongol Empire had been built to project military power and extract resources. What it also created, as consequence rather than intention, was a more connected world. That connectivity was dangerous and transformative in equal measure. And the world that emerged from it, reshaped by plague and trade, and the movement of ideas across distances that had previously slowed them to a trickle, was different enough from what had come before that the people living in it could feel the change, even if they could not name its source. The roads were still there long after the empire that built them was gone. And what had traveled those roads? In both directions. was already embedded too deeply in the civilizations that carried it forward to ever be removed. Chapter 10. The Limits of Empire. There is a particular kind of lesson that only defeat teaches, not the lesson of how to fight better, though that lesson is sometimes available. The deeper lesson, the lesson about where the actual boundaries of a system are, as opposed to where its builders believe them to be. The Mongol Empire spent the first 6 decades of its existence without needing to learn that lesson, because it had never needed to. Every obstacle had yielded. Every army had broken. Every city had eventually fallen. The system had been tested against the most formidable opponents in the world and had not found its limits. But the limits were real, and the campaigns that revealed them tell us something essential about the difference between a system that is extraordinarily effective within its optimal conditions and a system that can operate anywhere against anyone, regardless of circumstances. Meet the man at the center of one of those limits. Tran Hung Dao was the Vietnamese general who commanded the resistance to the Third Mongol invasion of Dai Viet in 1287 to 1288. He came from a royal family of the Tran dynasty and had spent years studying the Mongol campaigns that had devastated much of Asia. He understood their tactics. He had read accounts of how they had defeated armies far larger than his own. And he made a decision that the commanders of most of the Mongol Empire's opponents had never managed to make. He decided not to fight the war the Mongols wanted to fight. The Mongols wanted a decisive engagement in open terrain, where their cavalry and combined arms system could operate with full effect. Tran Hung Dao refused to give it to them. When Mongol forces advanced, he retreated into the forests and mountains of the Vietnamese interior, abandoning cities rather than defending them, keeping his army intact rather than spending it in battles he could not win on his opponent's terms. He conducted sustained harassment of Mongol supply lines, attacked isolated units, and waited for the combination of tropical heat, monsoon rains, and logistical breakdown to do what his armies could not accomplish directly. His tactical masterpiece came at the Battle of Bac Dang River in 1288. He had his men drive iron-tipped stakes into the riverbed at a point where the tide rose and fell dramatically. He lured the Mongol fleet upriver at high tide when the stakes were submerged and invisible, then engaged them with a Vietnamese force that gave ground slowly. When the tide fell and the Mongol ships attempted to withdraw, they were impaled on the stakes. The fleet was destroyed. The land forces, cut off from their naval support and exhausted by months of guerrilla warfare in conditions that negated their advantages, withdrew. The historian Kenneth Hall, in his study of maritime trade and state development in Southeast Asia, published in 1985, places Bac Dang in the context of a broader Vietnamese strategic approach that used geography, mobility, and patience as weapons. Tran Hung Dao understood something that the Khwarezm Shah and the Hungarian king and the Jin emperor had all failed to understand in time. The Mongols could be beaten, but they could only be beaten by someone who refused to fight on their terms and had the discipline and the terrain to make that refusal stick. After the Bac Dang disaster, Kublai Khan reportedly planned a fourth invasion. He died in 1294 before it could be launched. His successors did not attempt it. The lesson of Southeast Asia had been absorbed even if it was never explicitly acknowledged. The Japan campaigns revealed the same limitation from a different angle. In 1274, a Mongol force crossed the Korea Strait and landed at Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu. The fighting was fierce enough to establish that the Japanese defenders were not easy opponents. A storm struck the invasion fleet that night, causing significant damage and prompting withdrawal. In 1281, a far larger force assembled, estimated at between 100,000 and 140,000 men across 2 fleets. The 2 fleets failed to coordinate their arrival. The Eastern Fleet was held on the beaches by determined Japanese resistance for weeks while waiting for the Southern Fleet. Then a typhoon struck the combined fleets in Ogedei Bay and destroyed a large portion of them. The historian Thomas Conlon, in his detailed study of the Mongol invasions of Japan, published in 2001, and the archaeologist Randall Sasaki, whose underwater excavations of the Ogedei Bay site recovered physical remains of the wrecked fleet. Both argue that the storms were real and genuinely catastrophic, but that the Japanese defensive performance should not be minimized. The Japanese had learned from the first invasion. They had built defensive walls along the coastline. Their fighters had adapted tactics to counter the Mongol approach. The storms were decisive. They were not the only reason the invasion failed. What the Japan campaigns revealed about the Mongol system was something that the steppe environment had never required confronting. An island of forested mountains with narrow coastal approaches and no interior road network was terrain where cavalry advantages were negated almost completely. The Mongol infantry that fought on the Kyushu beaches without room to maneuver was a significantly diminished version of the combined arms force that had operated so effectively on open plains. You cannot feign a cavalry retreat when there is nowhere to retreat to and no open ground to turn and destroy a pursuing force. The failure against the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria had a different character. The Mamluks were not simply better positioned geographically. Though the logistical challenges of advancing through desert approaches with limited water for horse herds were real, they were also, crucially, opponents who understood Mongol tactics from the inside. Many Mamluks had been recruited from the Kipchak Turks of the Pontic steppe, the same cultural and military tradition that had produced Mongol cavalry methods. They had grown up riding and shooting in ways that made Mongol tactical innovations familiar rather than mysterious. They were not surprised by the feigned retreat. They had practiced variants of it themselves. The historian Reuven Amitai's careful analysis of the Mamluk-Mongol confrontations shows that the Mamluks combined tactical sophistication with institutional resilience in ways that made sustained Mongol pressure impossible to convert into the kind of decisive victory that had ended campaigns in China and Central Asia. The frontier held, not because of a single miraculous battle, but because the combination of geography, logistics, and opponent quality consistently made the cost of advancing higher than the benefit of doing so. These defeats shared a common lesson. The Mongol system was built around specific advantages: mobility, coordination, psychological pressure, combined arms capability that operated with maximum effect in specific conditions, open terrain, opponents who tried to meet them on conventional terms, logistical reach that did not exceed the horse's operational range, where those conditions did not exist, where terrain negated mobility, where opponents refused conventional engagement, where logistical reach was stretched to its absolute limit. The advantages diminished to the point where the calculation changed. Genghis Khan had built a machine optimized for specific conditions. Those conditions covered an enormous range of terrain and opponents. They did not cover all of them, and the world outside the machine's optimal range was larger than any Mongol ruler fully reckoned with. The empire that had seemed limitless had found its limits. What happened inside those limits? As the successor states began to turn on each other and the long process of dissolution began, would determine what the Mongol century left behind when the armies finally stopped moving. Chapter 11. The Dissolution and the Shadow named Timur. Empires do not usually end on a specific day. They thin out. The authority that once reached everywhere begins to reach less far. The institutions that once enforced compliance begin to enforce it less consistently. The people who once feared the consequences of resistance begin to calculate that the consequences might be manageable, and somewhere in that long process of thinning, the empire stops being an empire and becomes a memory of one. The Mongol Empire thinned out across most of the 14th century, and it thinned differently in different places, which is itself a measure of how much the four successor states had diverged from each other. The Yuan dynasty in China faced the combination of pressures most acutely. The Black Death had moved through China before it reached Europe, with severe demographic consequences that the historian Robert Himes and others have traced in work published through the 1990s. Floods and famines in the 1340s and 1350s created conditions of popular desperation that the Yuan administration, weakened by succession conflicts and increasingly disconnected from the Chinese population it governed, could not manage effectively. Rebel movements proliferated. The most successful of them, led by a former Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, who came from the lowest rungs of Chinese society, defeated the Yuan forces with a combination of military effectiveness and political intelligence that the last Yuan emperors could not match. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang entered the Yuan capital and proclaimed the Ming dynasty. The last Yuan emperor fled north into the steppe, ending Mongol rule in China after approximately 90 years. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan was, in its cultural and political orientation, a deliberate rejection of what the Mongol period had represented. The historian Edward Dreyer, in his study of early Ming history, published in 1982, describes the founding ideology of the Ming as explicitly nativist, presenting the dynasty as the restoration of authentic Chinese civilization after a century of foreign rule. The cosmopolitan openness of the Yuan court was replaced by a more inward-looking cultural policy. The great maritime voyages of Zheng He, which briefly extended Chinese naval reach across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century, were suspended and eventually prohibited. Whether the inward turn of Ming China was directly caused by reaction against the Mongol period or reflected longer-term dynamics in Chinese political culture is a question historians continue to debate. But the Mongol experience and its aftermath were part of the context in which those decisions were made. The Ilkhanate in Persia dissolved more gradually. The last recognized Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, died in 1335 without a successor whose claim the fractious princes could agree on. The territory fragmented into competing successor states. The Persian cultural tradition that had absorbed and eventually transformed the Ilkhanate survived the dissolution with remarkable continuity, carried forward in language, literature, and architectural forms that persisted across the political fragmentation. The conquerors had left. The civilization they had been absorbed into remained. The Golden Horde in the West persisted longer in recognizable form, but its persistence was increasingly nominal. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, in which a Russian force under Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated a Golden Horde army, was the first significant Russian military victory against Mongol-derived power in over a century. The historian Charles Halperin argues that Kulikovo's significance was more psychological than immediately political, since the horde recovered and reasserted itself within 2 years. But psychological significance is real significance. A people who have believed for a century and a half that a certain power is unbeatable are changed by the discovery that it is not. The full dissolution of Golden Horde authority over Russia came incrementally across the 15th century. As the horde fragmented and the Muscovite principality grew in strength. Ivan III's formal refusal to pay tribute in 1480 is the conventional marker of the end of the Tatar yoke, though the process it symbolized had been underway for decades. And then, from the heart of the collapsing Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, came a man who complicated every simple narrative about the end of Mongol power. His name was Timur. He was born in 1336 in Kesh, near Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan, into a Barlas clan of Mongol origin that had been Turkicized and Islamicized over the preceding century. He spoke Turkish and Persian. He did not speak Mongolian. He was Muslim in almost every cultural and linguistic sense. He was not Mongol, but he claimed the Mongol inheritance with a deliberateness that reveals something important about what that name had come to mean a century after Genghis Khan's death. The Mongol name still carried power. It still meant something in the political imagination of Central Asia that no other name could replicate. Timur could not claim direct descent from Genghis Khan in the male line, which was the form of descent that conferred full Chinggisid legitimacy in Mongol political theory. He solved this by marrying a Chinggisid princess and styling himself as son-in-law of the house of Genghis Khan, a designation that gave him reflected legitimacy without the direct bloodline he lacked. He kept a puppet Chinggisid Khan as a nominal figurehead while exercising all actual power himself. Think about what that arrangement reveals. A man building the most powerful empire of his era still needed to borrow the name of a man who had been dead for over a century. The ghost of Genghis Khan was still worth more than any living claim Timur could make on his own. The historian Beatrice Forbes Manz, in her authoritative study of Timur and the Timurid dynasty, published in 1989, describes a commander who combined strategic brilliance with an organizational capacity that few medieval rulers could match. His campaigns between approximately 1360 and 1405 swept through Persia, the Caucasus, India, Anatolia, and Syria. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, the event that sent the Ottoman Empire into the interregnum we have already examined in other contexts. He sacked Delhi in 1398 with a thoroughness that the historian Peter Jackson describes as one of the most devastating single attacks on a major city in the medieval period. He defeated the Golden Horde under Toktamish in a campaign that accelerated the Horde's fragmentation. Timur built towers of skulls outside cities that resisted him. The deliberate psychological warfare strategy was identical in its logic to what the Mongols had used 2 centuries earlier. He was also a sophisticated patron of architecture and scholarship. Samarkand, under his rule, became one of the great cultural centers of the medieval world. The Registan complex, the Bibi Khanim Mosque, the Gure Amir Mausoleum, where Timur himself is buried, are among the most magnificent examples of Central Asian Islamic architecture ever built. His grandson, Ulugh Beg, built an observatory at Samarkand, whose astronomical tables were among the most accurate of the pre-telescopic era. The contradiction between the man who built towers of skulls and the man who built the Registan is not incidental to understanding Timur. It is the point. Both were expressions of the same imperial will, the will to demonstrate that what he built was of the highest quality in every domain, including the domain of destruction. In this, he was recognizably the inheritor of a tradition that Genghis Khan had established. But here is the crucial difference between them. And it is a difference that explains why Genghis Khan's empire lasted 6 decades after his death, while Timur's began dissolving within a generation of his own. Genghis Khan built a system. Timur built a monument to himself. Genghis Khan had built institutions designed to function independently of any single personality. The decimal organization, the Yasa, the meritocratic selection of commanders, the postal relay network. These were designed to keep running after the man who created them was gone. And they did. For decades. Because they were embedded in the fabric of how the empire operated rather than in the will of any single person. Timur built a personal empire, everything held together by his own extraordinary competence and by the force of his presence. When he died in 1405, on campaign in the direction of China, the empire he had built began fragmenting almost immediately. His sons and grandsons fought over the inheritance with the same ferocity that had been directed outward during his lifetime. The monuments survived. The system did not, because there was no system. There was only Timur. And then there was not. The Timurid dynasty that followed produced remarkable cultural achievements in Persian poetry, miniature painting, and architecture. But it never consolidated the political power that Timur had wielded. One Timurid prince, named Babur, driven from Samarkand by the Uzbek Shaybanid advance in the early 16th century, fled south and eventually conquered northern India in 1526, founding the Mughal dynasty. The name Mughal is a Persian rendering of Mongol. The Mughals were Timurids by descent and claimed Mongol heritage, and their empire, which produced the Taj Mahal and some of the most sophisticated governance structures of the early modern world, was one of the last and most elegant expressions of the political tradition that Genghis Khan had set in motion 3 centuries earlier. The successor khanates of the Golden Horde were absorbed one by one into the expanding Russian Empire across the 16th and 17th centuries. The last direct descendants of Genghis Khan to rule a significant state were the Khans of Khiva in Central Asia, whose dynasty persisted until the Russian conquest of 1873, 7 centuries after the Kurultai of 1206. The bloodline of the man who had built his people from nothing was still producing kings. That persistence is itself a measure of how deeply the Mongol legacy had embedded itself in the political imagination of the world it had transformed. The age of the horsemen was ending. The gunpowder revolution that was transforming warfare across Eurasia in the 15th and 16th centuries was gradually shifting the balance of military advantage permanently toward states that could industrialize its production. And those states were settled, urban, and agricultural rather than nomadic. The steppe would never again produce a power capable of threatening the settled civilizations on its edges in the way the Mongols had. 2 centuries of expansion, a century of successor states holding what had been built, a long dissolution that left the world permanently altered. What that alteration looks like from inside the world it created is the question the final chapter will answer. Chapter 12. The legacy, the world the Mongols helped make. Before we talk about consequences and long-term effects, let us start with something immediate. Something you have almost certainly encountered this week without connecting it to anything that happened 8 centuries ago. If you have drunk coffee today, you are participating in a social institution whose form traveled to Europe through the Ottoman world. A world whose shape was partly determined by the disruptions the Mongol campaigns created in the lands it had absorbed. If you have eaten food influenced by the cuisines of Persia, Central Asia, India, or China, you are eating dishes whose ingredients and spice combinations moved along trade routes that Mongol protection made viable at a scale that had not previously existed. If you have used paper currency today, you are using a concept whose spread from China westward was accelerated by the commercial networks the Mongol period connected. If you live in a world where a disease can circle the earth in weeks, you are living with the dynamics of connectivity that the Mongol period helped establish at continental scale for the first time. The Mongol legacy is present in the world around you. Most of it is invisible, because it has been absorbed so completely into the civilizations it shaped that it no longer announces itself as Mongol. That invisibility is itself a measure of how deeply it runs. Start with Russia, because the Russian case is the most direct and, in some respects, the most consequential for the world we currently inhabit. 2.5 centuries of Golden Horde dominance shaped the political landscape within which the Muscovite state developed. The historians Charles Halperin and Donald Ostrowski have both argued carefully that direct institutional borrowing from Mongol practice was more limited than popular accounts suggest, and that many features of later Russian governance that seem Mongol in character may reflect parallel responses to similar challenges rather than straightforward transmission. This scholarly caution is important. What can be said with more confidence is that the Mongol period created specific conditions within which Russian political development occurred. The demographic catastrophe of the initial campaigns, the restructuring of power among the Rus principalities that followed, the particular form of tribute-paying subordination that characterized the Tatar yoke, and the eventual emergence of Moscow as the principality that successfully absorbed and outlasted Mongol authority. All of these shaped the political landscape of what became Russia in ways that were real, even if the precise mechanisms remain debated. The Muscovite expansion eastward across Siberia in the 16th and 17th centuries drew on geographic knowledge, administrative models, and logistical practices whose connections to the Mongol period the historian John Richards has traced in careful detail. The Chinese case offers a different and more legible legacy. The Yuan dynasty's disruption of the Chinese political tradition was profound enough that the Ming dynasty's response was a deliberate effort to reconstruct Chinese civilization on what it presented as pre-Mongol foundations. The inward cultural turn of the Ming period, the retreat from cosmopolitan openness, the eventual suspension of maritime engagement, were shaped partly by the experience of the Mongol century and the political reactions it generated. How much of the divergence between Chinese and European technological and economic trajectories in the following centuries can be attributed to this inward turn, and how much to other factors entirely, is a question that economic historians, including Kenneth Pomeranz, have examined at length without reaching a fully settled consensus. The Mongol period is one contributing factor among many in a complex story that resists simple causal chains. The Middle East presents the most immediately visible contemporary legacy. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 removed the institution that had provided a framework of political and religious legitimacy for the Sunni Islamic world across 5 centuries. What replaced it was a permanent competition between rival centers of authority that structured the politics of the Islamic world for centuries afterward. To say the Mongols caused the modern Middle East's difficulties would be to drastically oversimplify a chain of causes that includes European colonialism, the discovery of oil, the Cold War, and the decisions of many actors across many generations. But the Mongol period is part of the deep history within which those later causes operated. And understanding that deep history helps explain why certain political fractures have proven so difficult to close. The Kurdish people offer one illustration of how the post-Mongol restructuring of the Middle East created situations whose consequences are still unresolved today. Numbering somewhere between 30 and 45 million people across southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iran, the Kurds are among the largest ethnic groups in the world, without a state of their own. The specific borders that divided Kurdish populations among 4 modern states were drawn in the early 20th century during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But the political fragmentation of the region within which those borders were drawn had roots that reached back through Ottoman consolidation to the post-Mongol period, in which the region's political geography was first significantly restructured. Mongolia itself presents the most direct and, in some ways, the most poignant relationship with the Mongol legacy. The People's Republic of Mongolia under Soviet influence officially discouraged the cult of Genghis Khan, restricting access to the secret history of the Mongols and limiting public commemoration. After the Democratic Revolution of 1990 and the end of Soviet domination, Genghis Khan was rehabilitated with a thoroughness that suggests how completely the suppression had been felt. His image appears on Mongolian currency. The international airport in Ulaanbaatar bears his name. A massive steel statue of him on horseback stands 40 meters tall on the steppe east of the capital, visible for miles in every direction. The wandering horseman finally given a fixed monument in the landscape he came from. That statue is worth sitting with for a moment. The man who refused to be buried in a marked grave, who instructed his followers to conceal his resting place so completely that it has never been found, who built his authority on mobility and the refusal to be fixed in place, is now memorialized in 40 meters of steel on a concrete platform in a designated tourist area. There is something about that transformation that captures the essential strangeness of how civilizations relate to their own origins. The thing that made him powerful in his own time is the opposite of the thing that makes him commemorable now. He was great because he moved. We remember him by fixing him in place. The military legacy of the Mongol period is more immediate than most people realize. The emphasis on operational intelligence, on knowing the enemy's terrain and political structure before committing forces, on using psychological pressure as a force multiplier alongside direct military action, are principles that appear in military thinking across the following centuries in ways that historians of warfare have traced in detail. The postal relay system that Ogedei built was replicated in various forms by successor states and by empires, with no direct Mongol connection, that faced the same logistical problem of communicating across vast territories. The Mughal dak system in India, the Ottoman postal arrangements, the Russian relay network, all drew on models whose most elaborate pre-modern expression had been the Mongol yam. The pragmatic pluralism toward religion that the Yasa encoded, the practice of not forcing subject populations to convert, of exempting clergy from taxation, of allowing different religious communities to manage their own internal affairs. He was a practical strategy rather than an ideological commitment to tolerance in any modern sense. But it created a model of governance that acknowledged religious diversity as a manageable feature of political life, rather than a problem requiring elimination. That model influenced the successor states that inherited Mongol administrative traditions and contributed in various ways to later thinking about how diverse populations could be governed within a single political framework. The demographic consequences of the Mongol period reshaped economic relationships across Eurasia for generations. The world that emerged from the 14th century was demographically smaller and economically restructured. And the long expansion of population and economic activity that characterized the 15th and 16th centuries was partly building on a landscape that the catastrophes of the Mongol period and the plague had altered. This is not an argument that destruction was beneficial. It is an observation that the world the Mongols unmade, and the world the plague unmade, became the ground on which something new was eventually built. The thread that connects all of these specific legacies to a larger pattern is this. The Mongol Empire was arguably the first political entity to attempt, and in significant measure, achieve, the integration of the major civilizational zones of Eurasia into a single connected system. That system did not hold together permanently. The successor states fragmented, the connections attenuated, but the demonstration that such connection was possible, the infrastructure that made it real for a century, and the long-range consequences of the exchange it enabled, established a pattern that subsequent centuries elaborated rather than reversed. The world became progressively more connected after the Mongol period. The trade networks that expanded, the information flows that accelerated, the diseases that traveled further and faster, the ideas that crossed distances they had not previously crossed. All of these were continuations of dynamics that the Mongol period had helped establish at scale for the first time. We live in a world where connectivity brings with it exactly the combination of benefits and dangers that the Pax Mongolica demonstrated in its own time. The goods and ideas that flow globally also carry the pathogens and the disruptions. The infrastructure that enables commerce also enables conflict. The openness that allows cultural exchange also allows the rapid spread of things no civilization would choose to import if it had the choice. The Mongols did not create that dynamic, but they conducted the first large-scale experiment in what it looks like when a single authority connects civilizations that had previously been separated. And the results of that experiment, the extraordinary productivity of exchange combined with the extraordinary vulnerability of connection, have characterized every subsequent phase of the process they helped initiate. We began with a paradox. The most destructive force in human history was also the force that helped stitch the world together. Having traveled the full arc of this story, from the frozen banks of the Onon River, to the ruins of Baghdad, to the beaches of Japan, to the plague roads of Central Asia, we can see that the paradox was never a contradiction. It was always a precise description of how this particular story worked. The same roads that carried the plague carried the ideas. The same empire that burned the libraries connected the civilizations that eventually rebuilt them. The violence and the transformation were not opposites. They were expressions of the same force, moving in the same direction. At the same time, the Mongol Empire was built by people who had nothing except a set of ideas about loyalty, organization, and power that turned out to be more effective than anything the settled world had yet produced. Those ideas were not abstract philosophy. They were practical solutions to a specific structural problem. The step cycle of rise and fall, developed through decades of trial and error by people whose survival depended on getting them right. Genghis Khan did not read management theory. He learned from experience what the absence of good institutions costs, and he built institutions to replace that absence. And when he died, those institutions kept running, not forever, not without transformation, but long enough and thoroughly enough to reshape the world irreversibly. What he built lasted long enough to matter. What it destroyed also lasted long enough to matter. Both are true, and the history that chooses one and discards the other has not yet reckoned with what the Mongol Empire actually was. The historian Timothy May, who has devoted his career to studying the Mongol Empire with the rigor the subject demands, has written that any serious engagement with the Mongol legacy has to begin by acknowledging both the scale of destruction and the scale of transformation, and that collapsing either one into the other is a failure to see what the empire actually was. He is right. The towers of skulls were real. The burned libraries were real. The destroyed irrigation systems whose effects lasted for generations were real. So were the roads that connected China to Europe for the first time. So was the postal system that made continent-wide communication possible. So was the pragmatic pluralism that allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamanists to coexist within a single political framework at a scale no previous empire had attempted. Both things are part of the record. The history that chooses one and discards the other has not yet reckoned with what the Mongol Empire actually was. Think about Temujin, on the banks of the Onon River. The boy whose father had been poisoned, whose family had been abandoned, who had killed his half-brother at 14, who had been imprisoned in a wooden collar and escaped into a river to survive. None of that background should have produced what he became. The steppe had produced dozens of men with comparable hardship and comparable drive who rose for a generation and then fell back into the fragmentation they had come from. What made him different was not toughness. The steppe produced toughness in abundance. What made him different was that he looked at the structural problem that had destroyed every previous steppe confederacy and understood it clearly enough to solve it. He replaced the thing that had always failed with the thing that could outlast any individual. And then he built that thing well enough that when he died, it kept going. Now picture the 40-meter steel statue on the Mongolian steppe east of Ulaanbaatar. The horseman fixed in place on his concrete platform, visible for miles in every direction, looking out across the same grassland where everything began. Mongolia spent most of the 20th century being told that the thing it was most proud of was something to be ashamed of. When that prohibition ended, the response was that statue, a people reclaiming the right to decide what their own history means. That reclamation is still happening, not just in Mongolia, but in every country that carries the Mongol legacy in its bones without always knowing it. In the borders that were drawn across the ruins of what the Mongols destroyed, in the trade routes that still roughly follow the roads the yam stations once marked, in the political imaginations of nations that are still working out what it means to have been shaped, broken, and remade by the largest land empire the world has ever seen. The wandering horseman, who refused to be buried in a marked grave, left no fixed monument anyone could visit. He left something harder to find and harder to lose. He left a world that was different because he had moved through it. A world that was connected in ways it had not been connected before. A world whose connections brought plague and ideas and destruction and possibility in the same motion, along the same roads, toward the same destinations. That is the world he made. It is also, 8 centuries later, still the world you live in. And now that you know what you are looking at, you will never quite see it the same way again.